Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro. We're so glad you can be joining us this week. It's just me, your host and producer, Olga Peters, and the lovely representative and regular contributor, Emilie Kornheiser. Hello, Emilie.
Hi, Olga.
And jokingly, Emilie, when I set up this Zoom meeting today, I called it November, all the November feels. And I think this might actually end up being the title of the show because I think to a certain extent that's what we'll be talking about today. Post-election, we've had, of course, the major shift at the national level, but we have a lot of shifts at the state level too.
We
And
do.
so we have just some things to talk about and maybe even some feelings to get out. I don't know about you, Emilie. I think I'm still in the first stage of grief and I'm in denial. So I will probably sound completely foggy to all you listeners out there. But it's good to see you, Emilie. And I don't know about you. I have to say, I did have a lot of fun on Tuesday. Was doing some freelancing for the Commons. And so I traveled to Dover, Wilmington, Halifax, Marlborough, and Whitingham. And it was just a blast to be out in those communities and talk to people who are coming to the polls and why, what brought them to vote in person rather than send in their ballot early, and just to hear what people were thinking and to overhear all the conversations that were happening at the polls, just because everyone knows each other and everyone's saying hi, and it's not just about casting a ballot. It's about, hey, how's your kids, and I haven't seen your mom in a while, and are you still volunteering for the cemetery committee, and those kind of community conversations just brought me a lot of joy, I have to say, on Tuesday. You were very busy on Tuesday, so up until the results started coming in, kind of like, what was it like? What were you hearing from folks out in the community?
So, I like to be at the polls at 7 a.m. when they open, always. I'm always the first representative, the first candidate there. There, there have never been voters there at 7 a.m. when I've showed up before, even though that's when the polls open. And there was a line out the door, like to the door. The door
To
was
the door,
locked,
yeah.
and there was a line in the parking lot when I arrived. And people
And this
started.
is Brattleboro's
This is
Municipal Center?
Brattleboro.
Okay,
Brattleboro voting happens at the American Legion,
that's
which is
right.
right next to the municipal center.
Thank you.
And so there was a line through the parking lot, and all the candidates are in this like cordoned off area with actually like caution tape, um, which our town clerk swears is just because that's the only tape that's available. And I asked if maybe we could have different tape, and she said, "Sure, when this roll is gone." And I was like, "What if I bought a new roll?" Because it's very like it really creates a very funny vibe to be around, have the caution tape surrounding you as a politician. But lawn signs all around us. People started filtering in. Journalists were there. Kevin O'Connor was there with us for most of the morning. Congresswoman Ballant came for a few hours. Ian Goodenow, Molly Burke, and I were there for sort of like the full long haul together. And our senators came by as they were sort of traveling around the state, I mean, around the county. And while I was standing there, and it's been like, it'd been days of sort of frantic nervousness. Am I doing enough? Am I not doing enough? Like, what's my role? What's going to happen nationally? But while I was standing there, and standing there is like not a tangibly productive activity. We're actually quite far from the door to the polls. So a
Yeah.
lot of people can go from their car to the voting location and not even notice us standing there, let alone like come over and have a conversation. So frankly, we're just talking to each other for a lot of the time. We're not allowed to sort of heckle or catcall or bring people over. But just standing there feels so useful. Like while I was
Hmm.
there, I was not nervous anymore. I was like, this is the thing I'm supposed to be doing. And I don't know if it's like witnessing or like somehow holding up democracy with my stubborn little feet or like what it is, but it feels really good to just stand there. And so I did that until the sunset.
Oh, wow. You were there all day.
Yeah, yeah.
Oof, well done.
Thanks, I guess. I mean, like, not so hard. I was really just standing in one place on a beautiful day by myself and occasionally talking to voters. Folks came over to talk about like very specific town issues pretty regularly. Some people just said like, thanks for doing what you're doing. Mostly people came over looking for whatever wisdom we could impart about the national scene. And
Hmm.
I fear I was sort of like a constant disappointment to voters because I had no real wise words to offer.
Mhm.
And that was true like the whole week leading up to the election. People kept on like, and I was like, I am not available for, I don't know anything about the national scene. You don't know. I have hope and fear just like you. Like this is.
Mhm.
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 And then when I went in to vote, it was interesting. It was the first time I like didn't bring my phone in and take a picture of my ballot. Like I just filled out my bubbles and felt like there's my name
Yeah.
and I'm not gonna wear it out and just, I had a moment of like reflecting about like how it was cool to see my name and Kamala Harris's name on the same piece of paper. And that was it. And then,
Wow.
the results came in.
Mhm. And you and was it the county Dems held an election party at the Stone Church that night, right?
Yeah, we had an election night party. It was um, more than 100 people came.
Wow.
We had TV journalists there because Congresswoman Ballant was celebrating election night with us,
Oh, mhm.
rather than at like there's always a big party in Burlington.
Right.
So then rather the big party, and it was actually in South Burlington. Um, and so rather than be there, she was down with us. And it was funny, there were sort of TV reporters at the polls as well. And I went up and introduced myself to them because I didn't recognize them. And I know most of the Montpelier TV
Yeah.
reporters. And they both said they're from two different stations, and they both said, I usually do sports reporting.
And now I'm stuck in Vermont.
And like with all due, no, no, they do sports reporting in Vermont.
Oh, okay.
But they were trying to spread, they like basically the full team at the station was just doing election reporting. And, down in Brattleboro, we did not necessarily get like the A team on the politics beat,
Gotcha.
which I thought just had like a very funny irony to it, with all due love and respect to the nice young men who were sports reporters who were down with us.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. It's when Southern Vermont is feeling a little left out of the scene.
Hmm.
These
Well,
are
it's
the
funny
moments
because,
that reinforce it.
yeah, I mean, it did reinforce it. It's also always been funny because we haven't really talked about this very much, but the TV market, the TV stations that folks get here, who watch sort of what's regular TV called?
Uh, you mean like antenna TV
Or like network, they watch
network? Yeah,
network news. I think maybe that's
there
a
you
phrase
go.
that works. Okay.
Some people call them the ABC channels. You know,
Okay.
CBS, NBC, ABC.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
So those channels, people down here who watch those channels, we get the Boston area
yeah.
station, right? Um, and can't get Vermont TV news down here.
Hmm.
And so the coverage isn't sort of relevant to us for the most part. And all of the coverage that is relevant to us, we don't get down here. So it's a weird thing also for TV stations to come down here because we can't watch our own coverage, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I always think that's a fascinating thing, and it's one reason the Commons and the Reformer and the Bennington Banner and all those local papers are so important to me.
Hmm.
Is because, yeah, growing up, I could have told you what the mayor of Boston was doing, or even what the Albany, government was doing.
Yeah.
Had no idea what was happening in Montpelier. Oh, I could
Yeah.
even tell you what Springfield, Massachusetts was up to, but
Hmm.
yeah, no idea about Montpelier.
Yeah. And I mean, frankly, maybe that's part of why the Windham County Democrats did much better than some of our colleagues around the state. I don't know.
Oh, maybe that could be good
Mhm.
thinking.
I mean, I don't, if I don't think so. I think there was other factors, but it's sort of an interesting part of the whole puzzle.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And to show due respect to the sports guys who came down, it's not easy being a sports reporter. Things move fast, lots of names, lots of statistics. So they are actually very good at what they do, even
Absolutely.
if you and I know nothing about sports.
I was just joking with the speaker's chief of staff
Hmm.
yesterday about it's remarkable how much I've learned about at least sports metaphors since I joined the legislature. And I found out that he actually goes out of his way to use them with me because he thinks it's so funny to watch me react.
The blank look followed by the oh.
Yes, exactly. But I think one of the problems with elections these days is that they feel a lot more like sports and a
Yeah.
lot like, governance or civil society or whatever we want to call it. So maybe it's appropriate.
Hmm. Well, I was thinking about that actually this morning. I was listening to a conversation with a journalist from The Atlantic named George Packard, which, if any of you folks happen to have your Apple News app up and running, it was in conversation with him, and it was actually quite good. I recommend it. But he was talking about how, in his reporting, what in his mind tipped the country in Trump's favor is essentially the economy. That over everything else, that was the biggest issue, and that people objectively felt like they were doing better financially under Trump than they did under Biden, even if it wasn't necessarily Trump's actions
Hmm.
that was making the economy work well. Uh, some of the things he inherited, some of the things were not necessarily his decisions, that type of thing. And I was thinking about that and how elections are covered, because I think so often in this country we have short memories about things, and we don't always see how one one moment might connect to another.
Hmm.
So we don't necessarily, like, when we look at a president's 4 years, we just say, oh, anything that happened while they were in office, that must be all them. And we don't see that, like, what came before that may have influenced it or been carried over. Like, it's just like, oh, one president, chop history, that thread goes away. um and I was just kind of thinking this morning, yeah, how do we do better on that? Like,
I
how
don't
do we make those
know.
connections?
I don't know. I've been thinking a lot about that as well. And how sort of like the most present story about what even happened in Vermont, which is similar to what happened all over the country, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, um, we moved sort of 10 points to the right across the country. And that's what happened in Vermont.
Mm-hmm.
And when I look at that and like, if the easiest story to tell and the most present story that feels real to me is that like people are feeling a tremendous amount of economic insecurity, right? And I don't think there's been a single day of my service before being a legislator or being a legislator that I wasn't focused on economic insecurity as my top issue that I was working on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yet somehow the fact that, and I have had some success at the policies that I've worked on related to that. Not as much as I would like, and more than some people would like, right? And what's extraordinary to me about that is that I like, I don't know, have I done a terrible job telling that story? Do I always make things 1,000 times more complex than they need to be? And so no one hears what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Do people want to have economic success and think that that can only happen at the expense of their neighbors? And so when I talk about all of us, that doesn't resonate. I don't, my heart is not able to think that's true.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And I think what it comes down to is that like real policies that actually improve economic conditions for people take a long time to work.
Yeah.
So we can invest in housing, and we have. And even if we spent like the absolute maximum amount of money we possibly could and should, which we are not doing right now, it's going to be at least 5 years before that makes any difference on the cost of living for people related to their housing,
Hmm.
right? If we had succeeded in passing a family medical leave bill, and as we were developing it, we were creating one that had the absolute shortest time horizon to people actually getting benefits, it still would have been 3 years before people could actually take time off to care for their loved ones. And so what it winds up being is like the story, at least in Vermont, that I think the governor was able to tell with his very large bully pulpit was that like the pieces of the policy that might have been harder were elevated, right? Like the
Hmm.
taxes to pay for the housing were elevated. The housing is not felt by anyone. And no one, myself included, did a good job asking the governor, okay, so what are you going to do about everyone's suffering? You're blaming the Democrats for the suffering, but what are you actually going to do about the suffering?
Hmm.
And that's the thing that's really interesting to me about Trump, too, because like the what he's going to do about the suffering and anger was never clear at all,
Right.
right? It's just that he's screaming about the suffering and anger, and people then feel seen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Seen and understood.
Yes.
Yeah, I had a conversation with some economic development folks years ago, and I know I miffed them greatly with my comment, but they were talking about, oh, we're doing this, we're doing that, we're doing this, and they all had like 10-year horizons, the
Hmm.
efforts they were working on, and they were perfectly good efforts. I said, but I said, no one's going to care about what you're doing until they see their paycheck go up,
Yeah.
because it's not real until their paycheck goes up
No.
for so many people. And I know that that really insulted the person I was talking to, but unfortunately I think it's a reality. If you're struggling with housing, you don't want to hear it's 5 years away.
No, and I don't know if I'm like the only one of my colleagues that really admits this, or if it's just like I'm one of the only people that it's true. Like I didn't pay any attention to any of this until I paid attention to it.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's true for a lot of people with
And so like I didn't,
race.
I didn't vote in primaries. I had no idea what state policy looked like. Like I just felt like, my living conditions were getting worse than my parents had been, and capitalism was going to eat me alive.
Yeah.
And like for whatever reason, I interpret probably because of like the really incredible education I was able to get at Marlborough, like I interpreted that as like, you know, global corporate forces, neoliberal capitalist stuff was the problem, not my neighbor and not, my local government. But that's just sort of an accident.
Mm.
I don't know.
You
This
know,
is
that
very theoretical, and I think that was sort of that's one of the problems that we're talking about. So,
well, yes, I think you're right about that. Although I do feel, and one reason I think we started this show along with exploring stories was to hopefully illuminate how government works for folks. Because when you don't understand how a system works, it's just frustrating.
hmm.
And I actually was amazed. I was uplifted and dismayed at the same time by the number of people I saw coming to the polls, and we had a very high turnout in Vermont for voters. I was checking just the local towns, and according to like the Secretary of State, Brattleboro had like a 70% voter turnout.
Yeah.
Dover, I just went to the towns that I visited, 65, Halifax 79, Marlborough 86, um,
86?
86, Whitingham 77, Wilmington 69.
That's so
Um, you know,
wow.
that's a lot of turnout. And
Yeah.
yet I was very amazed at the number of people who came in and kind of didn't know what to do. They knew they had to show up to the polls. They knew they were going to cast a ballot, but like what happened in between, they actually didn't understand. And I saw one person get frustrated with a poll worker, not nasty, not mean, but just frustrated because the poll worker was trying to walk them through the process and they just weren't getting it. And partly it was the mail-in ballot had kind of confused them as well. But it brought home for me um, that how important it is that understanding and operating in our communities and our democracy is theoretical, but there's so much tactile that has to happen. And so many of us either never got that training
Hmm.
or, life is life and stressful and so never had the time to get the training, whatever it is. And so I think there's just a lot of frustration out there, even on how government moves from point A to point B.
Hmm. Yeah. No, and I know one of my friends went to a store to actually get supplies for the election night party on election day, and someone said something like the cashier said to them, like, "Oh, I think I should probably like today's the day to vote, right? Like, do I do that at the high school?" And my friend was like, "No, it's down at the American Legion." And they're like, "Oh, well, I'll go after work." And like they got out of work after 7, and like that was that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So like there was like I know that but what is there to, you know, it's a lot. It's all a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And it would be nice if, as a community, we had more of a thing like if that person's place of employment a few weeks before the election said, hey, because Vermont does allow time to go vote, right? I'm always a little foggy on this,
yes,
but
but I don't think it's paid.
it's not paid. That's I kind of think is the downfall. But
Yeah.
if that employer had said, "Hey, everyone's we're gonna vote. Who's gonna vote?
Yeah.
Do you need time to do that?" Like had kind of set something up,
Hmm.
that would be a really great community service. But
Yeah.
I think we're not there yet in many respects.
Hmm. Oh my goodness.
It's a lot to think about.
Hmm.
Um, and I think in the second half, which we're coming up on soon, we should talk about some things that are happening at the Vermont level because there
Yeah.
was quite a shift at the Vermont level. But before we head to the second half, um, just what are you sitting with right now? I mean, I know for my part, um, I am still sitting a little bit in shock and a little bit in grief.
Hmm.
Um, Although I do sympathize with everyone's struggle around the economy because we're all doing that,
Hmm.
or most of us are. Um, and but I think my biggest thing right now, or my biggest gut feeling is, okay, this is what we've been handed. This is what we got. So we can cry about it all we want. We can get as angry as we want, but the fact is we got to move forward. And so for me, I guess I'm starting to look at the next horizon, like what's next? Where are we going from here? Um, and it's where I start putting a lot of faith in the states because I do see them as the great experiments and where a lot of things can happen,
Hmm.
both positive and negative. But so that's kind of like where the stuff I'm sitting in right now.
Hmm.
I'm curious to hear from you.
Um, I think that I think that a lot of the reason that we're in this situation is we are still reacting to the terror of the pandemic
Hmm.
and of the racial reckoning that we experienced during the pandemic.
Mhm.
And we have not actually ever really talked or processed any of that adequately as communities or as a country. And so
Very
I
good.
am a person who likes to get things done. That's why I do what I do. And I really want to make sure that we actually all take the time to process what just happened before reacting. I am a state legislator because I think it's the most useful sort of bridge for me between my community and making a difference. But Vermont in particular, we might be sort of like one of the, greatest, most nimble, innovative labs. We are also one of the most dependent on federal funding of any state in the country.
Yeah.
And so I don't know how much of a, and in the end, we have a federal constitution, we have federal laws that always usurp state laws.
Mhm.
And so I don't know how much of a, bulwark, is that a word? Bulwark?
It is a word.
Is that the word I mean? We can be. I don't know how much, I don't know how much we can save ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. Because, like you said, we are so dependent on the federal government, and some of the innovative things we have done in the past, I'm thinking specifically around healthcare, um, have happened because we were able to get federal waivers or we were able to
Hmm.
get, yeah. So if the feds aren't willing to work with
Hmm.
of our policies, then yes, we're kind of stuck.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think is what you're saying.
Hmm.
Interesting.
Yeah. Sorry to be the bummer lady.
No, no, I think it's how do I put this? It's practical.
Hmm.
And it sets expectations.
Yeah.
I am not a huge, as much as I understand the impulse when I'm frustrated with something to just want to burn it all down
Hmm.
and start from scratch.
Yeah.
That's so rarely, or I shouldn't say it rarely, so often that causes unintended consequences
Hmm.
because it creates a vacuum and then nature tries to fill it as quickly as possible.
Hmm.
Um, and so I'm a little concerned at the federal level with the sense of let's burn it all down and start over. That feels like it's happening. And so I think the more practical we can be in our approach,
Yeah.
the better. So anyway, okay, folks. Emily and I will be right back here on WVEW, Brattleboro's community radio station. So stay tuned. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW, LP Brattleboro. And this is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. I want to thank BCTV for taking the video version of our show and sharing it with media centers around Vermont. And remind folks that you can subscribe to the podcast wherever you find podcasts. And Emily, representative from Brattleboro and regular contributor, what do we need to remind listeners of now?
Well, Olga, on the Montpelier Happy Hour, the thoughts and perspectives of the guests, hosts, speakers are those of those people and not the station, nor the platform, nor their employers or friends, just themselves speaking.
Well done. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Mhm. Mixed that one up a little bit and then got stuck on my own word. But
That's okay. I'm getting stuck on the new station ID. New stuff for both of us. I think we should shift. We have all the feels about what's happening at the federal level. Um, but where you and I have the most knowledge, and I don't, maybe you have influence. I'm just a lowly reporter, but is on the
words are
state level.
power, Olga. Words are power.
The pen is mightier than the sword. Um, I don't feel like I have a lot of words this morning. That's probably part of my problem. Um, anyway, let's shift to the state level because that's really where I think a lot of our energy tends to go. I have to admit, I was surprised by some of the outcomes of the elections. That I think is it fair to say, Emily, that there's been some shifts at the state level that could
Yeah.
have consequences, good or bad, depending on how you look at things. But
Absolutely. So all of the statewide Democratic candidates won their seats back handily, with the exception of Lieutenant Governor Zuckerman, who was an unbelievably close race and lost to a Republican
yes.
who used to be a Democrat. And Zuckerman used to be a progressive and not a Democrat. So there's like a lot of party identity confusion in that race. Um,
Mm-hmm.
the person who did win the race aligned themselves very closely with Governor Scott. And so I would say that makes him a Republican, no matter what he used to be.
That's John S. Roberts.
Rogers.
Rogers, sorry.
Okay. And so
And
he
spell.
won the race. The lieutenant governor has no real power. So that's also sort of an interesting piece of the whole puzzle, like that would be the real race.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then down ballot House races and Senate races. Um, Republicans picked up seats across the board.
Yeah.
And I have not like looked at final voting numbers, but my understanding it was basically that sort of like everything shifted, 10 points to the right. And so even some districts that people didn't think were that tight um, came in for Republican candidates.
Mm-hmm.
Often sort of a two incumbent team of Democrats. One of those seats went to a Republican.
Yeah.
And strikingly, in the Senate, they lost two seats that there was a number of seats that it's been sort of described as a toss-up where incumbents there was an open race after long time incumbents had been there.
Mm-hmm.
But two seats that were held by incumbents were also went to Republican candidates. So that was quite striking. I think it's also interesting in the Senate that all of what is it, seven new senators that won are all men.
Mm-hmm.
And so the gender mix up, um, you know, that's real.
Mm-hmm.
That's a real thing there. And then in the House, we knew we'd lose a number of seats. The Democrats, that's what I mean by we, knew we'd lose a number of seats, but not at the scale that happened, and
Mm-hmm.
not the people that did lose their seats. A number of folks, chairs, vice chairs, House leadership, lost their seats, and so that is very difficult to grapple with. Both like
Well,
really like what it means for the next session is a very big open question.
yeah, and I think what I'd add to that, why the committee chairs losing their seats stood out to me was less what party they belong to for me, as it was that's that institutional knowledge that just went away. And that's someone in leadership who has been, hopefully, I think most of them were running successful committees, but so that causes can cause like a hiccup
Mhm.
in how that committee operates, which is where most of the policy is actually built and created. And so it's really important that we have committees that run smoothly with strong leadership. And it's not necessary to say that the next person who comes in won't be a good chair, but it's just it changes the workflow, I guess is how I would say it.
Very much so. And so, one very specific example is we knew we would have a new Senate Chair of Appropriations because the longtime Senate Chair of Appropriations, Jane Kitchell, did not run again. But our House Chair of Appropriations did not win her reelection bid. And
Hmm.
so we'll have a new chair of both appropriations committees. And that's a lot of institutional knowledge to catch up on.
Yeah.
So that's one example. On my own committee, my ranking member and then another really strong newer member of the committee both didn't win re-election.
Mm,
And so, I think it's very clear that Vermonters want us to grapple with property taxes this year. I have fewer resources to do that with now.
mhm,
Like whether I think there's actually fairly decent consensus, across party that like something needs to be done about property taxes. I don't think anyone thought that the property taxes were the scale of the increase was acceptable. The governor did not have a plan to do anything about it. The governor still seems to have no plan to do anything about it. And yet now we have sort of less institutional knowledge to grapple with an incredibly complex problem. And so, yeah, that institutional knowledge is really, it's pretty wild.
mhm. Yeah, especially when the legislature does tends to happen in a very compressed time frame
Hmm.
between January and April-ish, May-ish. So yeah, let's talk about your committee for a moment with the work around taxes. Just on a practical level, you said I now have fewer resources to work with. Are there certain skills or knowledge base that the committee members who did not win their seats have taken with them? Like, what's that on a practical level? Let's just talk about like what this means. Yeah.
Yeah. So, the way property taxes work in Vermont is very complicated. I don't necessarily think that that's a problem. People don't mind that our income taxes are very complicated. The way we create equity is often to add complexity.
Mhm.
And but one of the pieces of that is that changes to the system, how they pan out in communities or on tax bills is often very counterintuitive. And it's very hard for people to believe that it's counterintuitive.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so having people who have really grappled with seeing like, hey, I have this great idea to fix everything. Oh, wow, that actually doesn't do what I thought it would do. And like have that felt experience of that, losing those folks is hard.
Mm.
Losing folks who can actually just explain the system and its dynamics to colleagues, and have really practiced doing that, is that's a real loss. Um, and we had two really strong Republicans on the committee too, who did not run for the House. They ran for the Senate. And so
Mm-hmm.
they're also not on the committee anymore. And they were incredible assets to the committee when wrestling with these issues. So it's not actually entirely about sort of losing partisan perspective. It's really just losing like overall capacity in the committee. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so that's part of it. One of the members was actually both members that were Democrats were really engaged in career technical education work, which is a priority of the governor, but he's never put forward a real proposal to do something about it.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them had been grappling with that in a really serious way this summer in order to bring us something in the fall. Um, yeah, those are sort of some of the pieces. It's also being on Ways and Means is very different than being on other policy committees. The relationship with our joint fiscal office and knowing sort of how to manage that, how to ask questions in ways that are useful. We other policy committees often have sort of very consistent witnesses throughout the year, and we tend to really be like hopping around because we take on so many different policy issues.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that sort of the habits of that are different.
Well, and also your job as the committee, if I remember correctly, isn't to look at the policy and weigh its merits. It's look at a policy and say, okay, then how do we pay for this? And what kind of
Yes.
taxing structure would have to go along with it?
And so that's a really being able to sort of remove yourself from that piece of the policy is a very much a learned skill as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, one thing that was talked about a lot over the last biennium was the supermajority
Hmm.
that Democrats held in the House and the Senate. Does Is that still there or has that been lost?
No, no. We sort of had a feeling that we might have a severely reduced majority and might not have the super majority, but thought it would like, imagined it would be close enough that for certain issues we could pick up a few people who weren't Democrats.
Hmm.
Um, One of the things that's really, but at this point, I actually don't have the exact numbers in front of us,
Mm.
um, but very much have a majority and not would need a significant number of Republicans in order to get over 100 votes on something. And that's true in the Senate as well. Um, and so that means really different things about policy. So if I think about the conversation we were having before the break,
Hmm.
um, about what might happen on the national level and what we might be able to do about it, say at the national level, the federal government decided to get rid of food stamps. At the state level, if we had a Democratic supermajority, we would say food stamps are really essential so that Vermonters don't starve and so
Hmm.
that kids and families can get their needs met. And so we would shift our resources to make sure that we were meeting that need. Um, and maybe we do that by raising taxes on sort of the wealthiest Vermonters,
Hmm.
right? The governor's made it really clear that that's not on the table. And so I'm like, we really have a lot less flexibility in sort of thinking creatively about how we will respond to the national landscape.
Hmm. I'm actually curious to see what the loss of the supermajority will mean for Governor Scott. Like, on the face of it, you would think, oh, this is going to make it easier for him to get his policies through. However, we have talked on this show about how sometimes he doesn't actually put anything forward. He just will then veto the policy that's there. Um, and so I'm wondering, without a supermajority, is he actually going to have to step up and stand behind some of what he wants to see happen? And he will no longer just be able to blame things on the legislature, like has somewhat been his habit.
So if I use education finance as an example, it was really clear that he and his team decided it was better to let nothing happen and have the Democrats take the fall for it than to really like get into the nitty-gritty of policy and try to work together to get something done. Um, did not put forward a viable idea despite really significant requests for one. And that's true in other policy areas. This is just the one I know the most. Um, I don't know why he would not continue to do that this biennium.
Mm.
Um, Especially if, Vermonters, including reporters, don't ever ask, so what's actually your plan for that, Governor? And when he does not answer the question, ask again.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because I have not, one of the things that was sort of remarkable on the campaign trail is that still there were no ideas put forward about what to do about any of that from Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
So
Interesting.
I don't know why we still have the majority, and so we can still take the blame for governance problems, even though it's actually the administration that is responsible for a lot of it. It's one of the very weird things about divided government is that like I don't feel justified in fully blaming the governor for anything. I think there's a real shared responsibility for our failures, but that's probably me thinking too hard.
We shall see.
We shall see.
Mm-hmm. Um, Now, what about other leadership positions at the state level? Jill Krowinski, who has been Speaker of the House,
Mhm.
maintained her seat, although that does not guarantee that she will remain Speaker of the House.
Mhm.
Are there other areas of leadership that have shifted that
Yeah,
you can know?
so as I mentioned before, the appropriations chair from last biennium did
Hmm.
not win re-election, so we'll likely have a new appropriations chair. Um, it is quite normal after a loss like this to have, significant shakeup throughout sort of the party, and so likely we will have a new majority leader and a new leadership team on that end, as well as I would imagine that the Vermont Democratic Party is going to see some changes as well in that leadership structure.
Hmm.
But I'm not really involved in that because there's only so many things that I can be paying attention to.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that will be true in the Senate as well. At this point, there's not another Democrat running to be speaker.
Hmm.
And we do still have the majority.
Hmm. Now, Laura Sibilia has said she would like to put her name forward as speaker. Is that still true?
I have not spoken to her in the last few days, but my understanding is yes.
Okay. And what about, have you heard anything on the side of the Republican, like the Republican side of leadership at the state and Senate levels? Have you heard of any shifts happening there?
I have not, and in the sort of reporting that I have read, basically they just said like we're very surprised and we need to evaluate what we're going to do now.
That's what I had seen too, but I wanted to check to see if there
No,
was new
I don't have any.
information.
I don't have any inside gossip, but I haven't even gone looking for some.
Hmm. Yep.
Mhm.
So between now and the new biennium,
Mhm.
there is still work to be done. I think we can expect a number of reports to come out
Mhm.
on different topics. What will be occupying your time between now and I think it's January 4th when we go back to the State House.
I'll be thinking about what composition on the committee would look like.
Hmm.
Um, I'm not definitely chair of Ways and Means again,
That's a
but
good
I
point.
need to prepare as if I will be, because otherwise I won't be prepared. Um, Talking to my colleagues about what an agenda would look like for next year,
Hmm.
both sort of across the board as well as um, in Ways and Means, and really like quite focused on education finance, and making sure that we have an education system that we can pay for, and that meets kids' needs in a really significant way. I think we need both of those things. And then, you know, I'm if our caucus priorities reoriented more solidly towards affordability, that would be like a dream for me. Like,
Hmm.
I think that's what Brattleboro is asking of me. Um, but I think there's a real difference of opinion in what that means and what responsible budgeting means across party. And for me, it often means sort of investing more in order to make sure investing more in government so Vermonters can save money.
Hmm.
And so I'll be thinking through those kinds of things.
Yeah, that's the tricky thing about big words like affordability. We all agree
Mhm.
on them that we want them, but what that actually looks like and what that means and how that translates into policy is not always the same thing.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Agreed.
Uh, any certain reports that you're particularly keeping an eye out for?
Um, in like the deep nerdy vault, there's a report coming from the Department of Taxes on how we appraise properties
Hmm.
that I'm very excited about. Um, that's from the Property Valuation and Review Division at the Department of
Hmm.
Taxes. That's the one I'm most excited about right now.
I thought there was one coming out on ed spending too. Was
Oh,
there?
that one came out already.
Oh,
Sorry.
it did. Okay.
Yes.
Missed
Yes,
that.
there was a report from Larry Pikus and his team about education spending. And then I'm really just hoping for like a lot more data from the Agency of Education that I have requested a number of times and have not yet received.
What type of information?
Oh, like what we're spending money on and where, what trends are in that spending. Like pretty basic stuff that we don't have.
Hmm. I'm often surprised at how Vermont can be a little, or at least it feels, as someone who sometimes goes looking
Hmm.
for data, can feel a little inconsistent in what it collects and what it doesn't.
Hmm. Yeah. I think they collect all the data. They just can't seem to get it to me and to the Commission on the Future of Education. We're
Hmm.
gonna, yeah, we'll figure it out. I hope. Because it's really hard to make really big, bold changes without actually knowing what's happening.
Right, right. Yeah, because data can give you a really good snapshot of the landscape that you're working
And
with.
as I said much earlier, most education finance issues are very counterintuitive. And so really actually need the data in order to model impacts.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, in the last few minutes, before we have to say goodbye until next week, um, it was good talking to you,
It was good
Emily,
talking to you, Olga.
and sharing some of the feels
Hmm.
and the frustrations.
Yeah.
Um, but we're not done yet. And I guess that's something I was comforting myself with this morning, as small as it is. On on November 5th, I
Hmm.
did my work for the Commons, and I
Hmm.
went around and I gathered and I sent copy in and I sent photos in,
Hmm.
and then watched the election, and then about 2 a.m. kind of fell into bed,
Hmm.
hoping for a miracle that didn't come. Um, but even if the election had gone differently,
Hmm.
I this week am working on an article from VBM.
Yeah.
Regardless of how the election went, I am still doing that. So I guess I was comforting myself that regardless of what happens at the state level or
Hmm.
the federal level, we get up the next day and we do our work,
Hmm. Agreed.
and there's comfort in that.
There is some comfort in that. There's some comfort in that. And I also hope we take the time to figure out what comes next
Mm-hmm.
instead of just, carrying on.
Well, like you said, instead of just reacting.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. The
And
work, I do think that in some ways the work remains the same, right? Like we still need, like, we're showing up for our neighbors, um, and making sure that the strong community ties we have in Vermont, just get stronger.
mhm, yeah, yeah, there's a lot of things that the federal government can do for us, but there's a lot of things it can't.
Hmm.
So yes, you're right. The work remains the same on some level.
Yeah.
Well, Representative Emily Kornheiser, so glad we could have this conversation this week. If people want to reach out to you, how do they do that?
Folks can go to emilykornheiser.org and sign up for my newsletter, send me an email, give me a phone call. Um, and then I'm always happy to have a really long conversation in the jam aisle at the grocery store.
And you can always reach the Montpelier Happy Hour at the Montpelier Happy Hour at gmail.com. Find us every Friday on WVEW LP Brattleboro, rebroadcasted on Wednesday mornings, BCTV, and of course, wherever you subscribe to your podcast. Take care, everyone, and have a good weekend.